Myrtle Beach native Kathryn Cox Hedgepath is the creator and narrator of the Myrtle Beach History, Trolley, and Step-On tours. She has traveled to 40 countries on 6 continents and uses her experience to convey our local history through a world lens. Kathryn returned home from New York City in 2002 to marry her beloved husband, Jenks, after a career in television and publishing, and even worked in Space Shuttle Operations at NASA headquarters in D.C. for a semester before starting her undergraduate school at Georgetown University. Her first career job was as a personal assistant to television icon and wildlife expert Jim Fowler of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom fame. Her dad, Myrtle Beach's first veterinarian, arranged the job interview when Jim Fowler spoke at a veterinary conference in Myrtle Beach. She is proud to be able to trace her family history in Horry County back to pre-Revolutionary War years and enjoys sharing our local history with visitors, newcomers, and locals. Let's give a big hand for our speaker today, Kathryn Cox Hedgepath.
Hello, everyone. Remembering Myrtle Beach's German POWs. 80 years ago, D-Day, Tuesday, June 6th, 1944. You had Americans going by boat to Omaha Beach to fight Germans. 48 hours later, on Thursday, June 8th, you had Germans coming by train to Myrtle Beach to help Americans. We started bringing POWs here during World War II in April of '42 for 2 reasons. One is to help the Allies. They were trying to survive a war over in Europe, and they were taking these prisoners, but they really didn't have the resources to keep them up to the standards that were dictated by the Geneva Conventions. Well, that sounds pretty noble, but our government had an ulterior motive. You see, we had a bunch of empty troop carriers sitting on the other side of the Atlantic that we wanted to bring back over here for safety. And we thought, well, maybe if we had German POWs aboard those troop carriers, maybe we wouldn't get torpedoed by German subs or U-boats. Now, when they first came here, the POWs were just sort of grouped together in camps, and nothing really happened for about a year. But in the following year, the Provost Marshal General of the Army, he was the gentleman who was in charge of the care of the POWs. He did 2 things. The first was that he separated what I like to call the radicalized Nazis from the general population. These were the guys who really believed in the Nazi cause, and that left about 80% of the prisoners who were either anti-Nazi or just indifferent and pretty much content just to ride out the war in America till the war was over and they would go home. The other thing that the Provost Marshal General did was establish the National Works Program. That allowed contractors to pay our government to hire POWs as labor. Now, when that project first began, Myrtle Beach wasn't eligible to have POWs because one of the first rules was that you could not have a POW camp any closer than 75 miles from a border. Of course, the Atlantic Ocean was our border. But by 1944, the policies had kind of relaxed, and if you could prove that you had a need for labor, and boy, we had it, in our timber industry, on our farms, and out on the actual Army Air Corps airfield, which is located on what became the Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, but what is known today as the Market Common District. So we definitely had a need, but the other criteria was that you had to have a place to put them. Well, we had an Army Air Corps airfield, so yeah, we had a place. So yes, we became eligible, and that's why we were able to start receiving our first prisoners in June of '44. Now, this was their first view of Myrtle Beach. Our first wave of prisoners was about 250 in the first wave. We had 600 here by the end of the war. They were at a little camp over in Florence, and they came in by train. So this is the back of our train depot. That's what it looks like today. Now, it took our prisoners about a year to get to Myrtle Beach, which was great because it gave them time to sort of figure things out for themselves. Let me tell you 2 things. One, According to the Geneva Conventions, you had to keep your prisoners in the same climate as the climate in which they were taken into custody. So they would have the proper clothing or equipment to deal with the climate of wherever you were. So we're in the South, it's warm, and most of our prisoners were actually captured in North Africa and the south of France. Now, what would happen is they would be put on those troop carriers, brought across the ocean, put on trains wherever they landed, and they were distributed throughout the country. Now, prior to leaving Germany, they had been fed a lot of propaganda about how horrible Americans were. And they were also told that, gosh, America was bombed out. We were on the verge of collapse. We were about to lose this war. But when they got here and they got on their trains and they're looking out the window, it's like, yeah, it doesn't even look like a war's going on here at all, so that must not be true. And so by the time they finally got to Myrtle Beach, they probably worked out that a lot of the other nasty things they had been told weren't true either. So they were probably a little more open-minded. Now, you can imagine that you're just hearing about the horrors of the Normandy invasion. And within a week, you've got Germans showing up at your farm to help you. It was a lot to process. Now, we needed the labor, but a lot of locals were pretty apprehensive about bringing the enemy into our community. She being one of them. That little cutie is Josephine Churchill Jenkins, my mother-in-law. Hey, Churchill. Now, she is standing on what looks like a boardwalk. Well, technically it is. That is on top of, now tell me, is it Papa's General Store? Is that the store across from where the clock is downtown? Because you see, the reason why they had to build a boardwalk on top of what was just normally a flat, I guess like asphalt commercial rooftop, is because we were in a war zone. In 1942, from January to June, we lost more than 5,000 American souls in American waters off the eastern seaboard because of what was known as the U-boat menace. You know, before we entered the war, we were sending all sorts of supplies and fuels and medicine over to the Allies and basically getting away with it. But once we entered the war, we were fair game. And they came after us with German U-boats all along the eastern seaboard. I had a gentleman on one of my trolley tours who told me that his dad was in the Navy during the war and his job was to patrol the eastern seaboard, and for that he received combat pay. Now, I grew up here, I studied World War II history here in the local schools, and I never heard any of this. I had no idea that we were right smack in the middle of it. In fact, if you were a student at Myrtle Beach High School during the war, during that time, especially in the spring of 42, during study hall, you had a choice. You could stay at school and do your homework, or you could walk a couple of blocks over to the beach, man a watchtower looking for either U-boats or enemy aircraft in the sky, and then when study hall was over, you'd go back to class and the next shift would come in. Now, what's happening here is Churchill's mom is in the background. She's basically changing shifts because, see, ladies like her mom would sit on the rooftops of these commercial buildings here in Conway or in Myrtle Beach or whatever. They'd have binoculars in one hand and a template in the other that had the outlines of what military aircraft looked like. You had the friendly planes. Of course, we had an Army Air Corps airfield here, so we had a lot of planes coming in and out, and also we had the Myrtle Beach bombing and gunnery range, so we had a lot of training going on here. So you saw a lot of planes, but you had to be able to look at this template and determine if any of those aircraft were actually enemy aircraft. Very exciting stuff, except if you're a little girl. Churchill said she was so bored, but yes, she was there, serving the country during the war. So thank you for your service. Now, a lot of the information that I had when I first started doing the tour that specifically relates to POWs is my Wednesday tour, my early Myrtle Beach in the World War II years. That information was pretty much mostly all gleaned from local history books and a few conversations. Until last summer, in June of 2023, I went to the National Archives. Now, they're headquartered in D.C., but they have satellite locations in various places, including in the suburbs at College Park, Maryland. And that's where I went, because that's where you will find this one box. I'm not going to take you through the whole process, but you don't just show up at the National Archives. If you want to do research there, go online and you will learn the whole gauntlet that you have to go through in order to end up at a table with a box, inside that box that has a file marked Myrtle Beach, and in that file are all the reports sent twice a month from our POW camp to the Provost Marshal General. And that's when I found out exactly when. I don't know if you can see that our camp opened on the Thursday, June 8th, and then the working contracts, those kicked in on Monday the 12th. So, if D-Day was on Tuesday, that by that following Monday, you very well may have Germans, on your farm or in your small business. It was just a lot to take in, but that was just the nature of war and what was going on. Now, we had a labor shortage, so we didn't even have anybody to build the barracks for where these prisoners were going to stay. So they were initially sent to a temporary camp. This is 70th Avenue North, so you'll see the new Ace Hardware, and off to the side is Cane Patch Swash. Now, I have learned during these tours that not everybody knows what a swash is. It is a predominantly southern term, apparently, that describes where the fresh water of a stream meets the briny water of the ocean, which is smaller than an estuary, which are wetlands where the fresh water of a river meets the briny water of the ocean. And we've got about 4 or 5 swashes within Myrtle Beach. And so this is what you see from the highway, and if you go on the back side, that's what the swash looks like. So that's pretty much what the temporary camp would have looked like. All it was barbed wire, 4-man tents, and about 30 American guards. And they were there temporarily. I didn't know how long temporary was. I thought it was just long enough for them to build barracks, but actually I found out through this report, that report, that they were stayed there until November. In fact, it was Veterans Day that they moved to what is now the Market Common. Now, we know from, let me just tell you a quick little story. When they got there, the thing that was the most taxing to them was the heat. Through all these reports, there are various references, multiple references in the beginning about these prisoners being seen by a medical, the medical officer. And then I read from personal accounts, the heat was what was the worst hurdle for them to get over. And as the reports progressed, there were fewer and fewer visits to the medical officer. But then on top of that, in September of 44, there was a hurricane. Now, it was probably Category 1, but can you imagine riding out a hurricane in a tent? One account said there was 4 men in a tent. One man was on each corner of that tent, holding it down, trying not to blow away. But they survived that. Now, from local history books, at least 2 of them I've found, we know that the camp at the Army Air Corps airfield was inspected by an international observer. His name was Edouard Patet. He was from Switzerland. He worked for the International YMCA, but he served as an international observer during the war. He would go to camps to make sure that prisoners were being cared for properly up to, to the guidelines of the Geneva Conventions. Now, we know he was there in November. I don't know if he came because the camp was built in November, or if they knew he was coming and they thought, we better go build a camp and move them there. Or if you're camping out in Myrtle Beach, you can be pretty comfortable through October, but come November, it gets a little nippy, so probably in violation of the Geneva Conventions at that point. So anyway, whatever the circumstances, we had a camp built in November. You can see at the bottom, they took men off of some of the timber crews who were carpenters and electricians to help build those barracks. Now, Edward went in, he investigated, he submitted a report, and in a word, he said that our camp was lovely. He said it reminded him of the boys' camp during the summer times in Switzerland, where he would pass the time away with all the trees and then the barracks. Now, this is actually what our airmen lived in, and you see at the bottom was built in 1942, but according to the Geneva Conventions, whatever our guys got, the prisoners did. So the prisoners were staying in facilities pretty much just like that. Now, the official name of our camp, that in all these reports, they don't call them POWs, they just call them PWs. So we were a branch camp. So we were PW branch camp, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. You can see that's our official mailing address from various correspondents. Now, our base camp was Fort Jackson, South Carolina, near Columbia. And then these are all the commanders. Now, I gleaned all this information from all those reports. So there were about 6 commanders. Now, what's really exciting to me is that here I'd been doing tours for years based on local history. Now, sometimes local history would kind of be hit or miss. You hope that it's accurate. Sometimes it might not be. But how thrilling, and let me tell you, thrilling to the point of tears, like, don't cry on these official documents. They don't like that at the National Archives. But to see the signatures of these men that I'd actually read about, at least some of them that I'd read about in local history books, namely James Bell and Graham Hunsaker. Now, Bell, he had it tough. I had already read that early on during his time, his first stint. There was a strike. Now, keep in mind that a lot of these prisoners, they were just barely out of their teens. These were young men. Now, what do young men do? They challenge authority. And so I think they were really just trying to see what they could get by with. So when it came time for them to get on the work trucks to go out to the timber sites or to the farms, there was a group of them that just refused to go. Well, the proper or the acceptable punishment for something like that was putting them on bread and water. So for a period of time, these men were served only bread and water. And according to the local history book, they got hungry, they got on the trucks, and they didn't have any problems after that. According to the reports, now the reports aren't that colorful, but sure enough, in the reports from that time period, yes, there were, on certain days, there were prisoners who did not work because they were on strike. And it went on for a little while, but after a while, after the bread and water worked, that remedied itself. But apparently, Mr. Bell needed a break because you see he's there and then he goes away for about 2 weeks and then he comes back. So I think he had just a little 2 weeks of R&R because he'd gone through a lot of stuff. So Graham Hunsaker, it was only here for 2 weeks, but I know more about him than anybody else because of a local history book. It was said that he went to West Point and that he and his wife lived in a guest house right across from where the Sky Wheel would be today. Because when you're going down the boulevard, if you look off to the right where the pavilion used to be, you'll see the Bowery that opened in 1944, Peach's Corner that opened in 1937, and the Fun Plaza was there too. So during the war years, that's where our guys could go for R&R. On the opposite side of the street, where Ripley's Believe It or Not and all those Ripley's attractions are, those were all guest houses. And that's where the officers, and usually officers and their wives, would live. Officers were usually much older. They were sort of almost to the point of retirement because, all the young, vibrant officers were, abroad fighting the war. So you kind of had to get the ones kind of easing out to be on the home front and to hold these official capacities. But Graham and his wife lived in this nice little guest house for about a couple of weeks, and then they went on to their next assignment. So Splinter City Disc Golf Course, that is when you're entering the Market Common from Kings Highway, this is what you see. Now, Splinter City Disc Golf Course is named after the nickname that was given to the buildings at the Army Air Corps airfield, because we hit the ground running. There was no time for brick and mortar buildings to be built. Hastily built wooden buildings were there, hence the name. Now, so the buildings were pretty much like all of our barracks, hospital, offices. Those were sort of over there, and then they were built starting in 41 and 42. But then in 44, when the POWs came, their camp was sort of on this side. And now we don't know exactly where it is, but it's sort of that way. I heard one account that it went all the way beyond where there's a Food Lion Center and there is, I guess, a golf cart store. And I heard it was actually as far as that store, but I don't know that for sure. But what's significant, and the reason I took this picture this way is something kind of special happened. We had a lot of misrepresentations to start with, but after a while, people got used to each other, and something kind of wonderful began to happen on Sunday afternoons when the prisoners had time to themselves. Now, the camp had to be near the road because on Sunday afternoons, the prisoners would begin to sing. They would sing German folk songs, military marching songs. At Christmas, they'd sing carols, and the locals would come and park along Kings Highway, where the grassy area is, put their blankets out, and sit out in the grass and listen to them like an outdoor concert. Sometimes you'd even have schoolgirls who would bake cookies, and they'd pass it through the fence to the guards to give to the Germans. What's next? So overall, if you had to be a German POW in America, Myrtle Beach was kind of a preferable place to be. But the best account I've ever heard was from a friend of mine who grew up in the restaurant industry. And he said back in the 80s, there were 3 couples, there were retired couples from Germany who were regulars. And the reason they retired here is because each of the men had been prisoners here. Now, my friend does not remember their names, but he remembered a few conversations he had with them. So he asked, well, what did you do? And some built barracks, so I'm assuming they must have been in the first wave. And some, if not all, worked at Trask Farms. The Trask family had farms right next to Myrtle Beach Farms. Now, if you know your Myrtle Beach history, you know what is now Broadway at the beach is owned by Burroughs and Chapin. That was previously Myrtle Beach Farms. So very near there. In fact, the farmer's nephew told me that this particular barn was where the Palace Theater used to be, and that's where the new surfing complex is going to be. I don't know if that's for certain, but anyway, it's in that neck of the woods. Now, the Trask farm was what they call a truck farm. So they grew all sorts of produce. And see this lovely barn in the background, that was built by the German POWs. And you see that they're, today you would have a semi-truck pull up to a distribution center. Well, this was a smaller version of that. You would pull your farm truck, your delivery truck up to one of these bays here, be loaded up with produce, and then take it off to a market somewhere else to be sold. And so these were the men who worked on the Trask farm and who built that barn. There are very few photographs of German POWs in Myrtle Beach. This is like the quintessential photograph. This was provided by Ms. Gore. Oh my goodness, her married Mrs. Trask, but her maiden name is Trask. Her married name is Gore, but she was the daughter of the farmer, and I believe she donated this photograph to Chapin Memorial Library. And this is the one that keeps sort of showing up when you talk about this particular topic. Now, I want to tell you what it was like for them, sort of on a day-to-day basis. When they arrived, they were allowed to keep their uniforms, but they were issued these khaki pants and shirts with big P and W, as you see, stenciled on the clothing so that they would be easily recognized when they were away from the base. They could work no more than 12 hours a day, and they had to have a 24-hour rest period each week, usually always on Sunday. Now, the officers didn't have to work at all, but they often did in order to stave off boredom and to earn a little extra money. Now, how much money you earned depended on what your rank was and what job you did. Now, no matter what amount of money you were paid, you weren't actually paid money. You were actually just issued coupons that you could exchange at the canteen at the airfield. Now, the most money could be earned if you went out to the timber sites. That was the hardest work. It was the most dangerous, but you earned the most money. And about half the men worked in the timber industry. Then the other trucks went out to farms. Now, but there was a certain perk because, let's see, is it this one? Yes. I'll tell you what the perk is in a second. This is a work contract. Now, through all my research, I have never come across of what a contract looked like to hire POWs. This was sent to me by someone who was on my tour last year. His, I think, grandfather down in Georgia had hired POWs, and this was a copy of his contract. Now, it's several pages long, but is the most interesting to me, because when you had a contract, you had to spell out what work they were doing, but you had to make two choices. Were you going to go pick them up, or was the military going to deliver them to you, which would cost more money? And then, were you going to provide their noonday meal, or did they have to bring provisions with them? So if you already had a crew on hand, you were going to be feeding them anyway, just throw a little extra in, so save a little money, and you would provide the noonday meal. So that meant that our prisoners got Southern home cooking. Now, they weren't supposed to eat with the Americans. In fact, the Provost Marshal General issued guidelines and rules and said, basically, you just don't get too friendly with the prisoners. You just tell them what they're supposed to do and leave it at that. He specifically said that you needed to be aloof. Yeah, if you met Southerners, we're not aloof. No, we brought these boys to the table. We fed them fried chicken, chicken bog, barbecue, whatever we could afford to, we did. Let's rest there. Now, there were also very actually cordial relationships developed on the base. There was, two things. Remember Graham Hunsaker? In those 2 weeks that he was here, it was his wife's birthday. So the prisoners who were assigned to the mess hall, they baked for her this elaborate German birthday cake with, candied fruit and nuts and a sugary sauce. And this is, during the wartime when things were rationed. So this was an elaborate gesture. And then there was a lady I knew before she passed away. She had been the secretary at the Officers Club. And she said that there was this one young German man who would clean the club every day, and he'd always bring in fresh flowers for the table. Yeah, she was real cute. Yeah, he was bringing flowers, but I bet it was for her. She just thought they were just the nicest young men. Now, once those hard-earned coupons were in hand, the prisoners would go to the canteen and exchange those coupons for toiletries, stationery supplies, German, English, German dictionaries were very popular, as were arts and crafts supplies. And they also had access to what I refer to as luxuries like chocolate and candy, cigarettes, and beer. Granted, it was American beer, and the Germans probably thought that was cruel and unusual punishment, but the Geneva Conventions let that slide. Now, as I said, basically anything that our guys got, they did as well. Our guys got to watch movies, popular, pretty recent movies. In fact, I know my dad was stationed over in Italy, and they would out in a camp out in the middle of nowhere, and they would send these, cans of film to be, shown in a tent at like it was a theater. They called it canned morale. Now, our guys, and these were the same movies the people at home were watching at their Saturday matinees. And at the Saturday matinee, you would watch a newsreel and a movie. Our guys did the same thing. The prisoners weren't allowed to watch the newsreels because that might be construed as propaganda. Now, for recreation, the fellows, those fellows my friend at the restaurant knew, they said that, they played soccer. They went surf fishing. They were really impressed about the amount of mullet they could catch in shallow waters. Oh, and also at the Trask Farms, they would send them extra produce. They'd have left over to send back to the camp, and the men would build campfires and roast potatoes over the campfires. But overall, at all the camps around America, soccer was like the number one recreation activity. Now, from my research, I have found 2 camps that were located on lakes because they had been lakeside resorts that had been commandeered to be camps. But from what I found, ours was the only one that had its own private beach because right across the street from the Market Common is the Myrtle Beach State Park. It had been commandeered already by the Army Air Corps for all of our airmen, and so therefore the prisoners got to go there. But unfortunately, tragedy struck only about a month after the first prisoners arrived. A young man by the name of Wilhelm Reichmann, he was swimming at the state park, gets hit by a wave and never recovers and drowns. I mean, they'd only been here for a month. I mean, this kid had survived, the whole war experience only to drown at the state park. Now, because they'd only been here for such a short while, I don't think the burial protocols have been put into place. So he was put in a shallow, temporary grave at Oceanwood Cemetery, our municipal cemetery, which is right next door to the Market Common. Now, we lost 3 by the end of the war, there were 3 who we lost. Herman Walter was next, and Wilhelm Krauss. Let me go through each one. So Wilhelm Reichmann, he was born on my birthday, and so he was 19 years old. Now, the information at the top came from findagrave.com, and then this information came from what was then called Camp Gordon, now Fort Eisenhower, because what was supposed to happen, if you were a prisoner of war who died in Georgia or South Carolina, your body was taken to Camp Gordon. That's just outside of Augusta, and that cemetery is still there. There are 21 German POWs and 1 Italian. So this information at the bottom comes from their death roster. So he was 19 years old, he was a butcher, and he was captured in Tunisia, and then died, as you see, drowning at Myrtle Beach at the POW camp. Herman Walter, he committed suicide. He was 43. He was older. He was a compositor. Now, from what I gather, a compositor was the person who would put the letters in a printing press, so kind of like a human word processor, really. But as he was older, I don't know why, but on May 7th, so the day that we knew that Germany had lost, he committed suicide. He was an orderly. That's why it says medical corporal. He was an orderly at the hospital at the airfield. And then the other fellow, So it's the day before the 4th of July. The war in Europe is over, but here this young man apparently died from an auto accident. And I saw in another place that he was actually hit by a car, but he was 19 as well. Now, down at what was Camp Gordon, now Fort Eisenhower, before COVID, I don't think they started doing it again since COVID, but prior to COVID, on the third Sunday of November each year, which coincides with Germany's National Day of Mourning, they would hold a ceremony at that cemetery to remember these men whose work was so important to us on the home front. Now, I want to throw this in. The big question is, how did we communicate with each other? Most people around here didn't speak German. N.C. Hughes Jr., he was bilingual. He spoke German. He was a civil engineer who surveyed not only the Myrtle Beach Army airfield, but that particular job put him in close proximity with the German POWs, and he would speak to the ones that he ran into. But just so you know, he surveyed a lot of Myrtle Beach and Brook Green Gardens. But he told his daughter, Tempe Hughes Ayler, who was a friend of mine, she was in college with my mom, that the prisoners, they seemed happy when someone would speak to them in their own language. So with those dictionaries, people would kind of learn a few phrases, and the prisoners would as well. So you kind of just using pidgin language, communicated that way. But then you would have prisoners like Walter Luff. He was when he entered the military, he had only gone through high school, but he had studied English in high school and did quite well and was actually fairly fluent. So he worked at a timber site, but he didn't do manual labor. He was the translator. And then after the war, his boss in the 1950s brought him back over, because see, when the war ended, he only had a high school education. So he went back to Germany, got his college degree, started a family, and then in the 50s, the whole family moved back and became vibrant residents of Conway, South Carolina. And a lot of the information that we know about local POWs comes from his writings and his interviews. Now, everything was going really well, pretty much, for the most part, between the contractors and the prisoners until the war in Europe ended. And that's when those newsreels the prisoners were allowed to watch those, but those newsreels became flooded with the images of the liberation of the death camps. We didn't really know the atrocities of the Holocaust that were going on, but we learned through those newsreels. We were horrified, but the Germans, golly, they were mortified that their people had done these horrible things. Now, not at our camp, but at one camp, they were so upset that they burned their Nazi uniforms. At another camp, they wanted to join U.S. forces to help us fight Japan. Now, the American knee-jerk reaction was that we wanted to exact revenge, and it really burned people up around here that they were paying money to Germans when Nazis had done these terrible things. But in time, tempers cooled, and by October of 45, it really came home to roost of how important those POWs being here was to us, because during the hurricane season, sometimes, as you know, we have severe flooding. In October of 45, we did have severe floods, washed out most of our bridges. Now, we didn't have the road system we do today, so we were really just incapacitated. Had we not had the prisoners here to build them back so quickly and efficiently, I don't know how long we would have just been, up a creek, no pun intended. So in time, it was realized that, the Nazis in the newsreels were not the same people we'd come to know and appreciate here, and the relationships pretty much mended. Now, all in all, it was a win-win situation having German POWs in America. They got good care, and our government's care of them went beyond mere compliance. Our government had an ulterior motive. They were creating something more powerful than propaganda, because you can drop leaflets behind enemy lines all day saying surrender, but that's not nearly as effective as having a prisoner under their own volition, no persuasion from us, riding home from a camp here saying how much better it was to be a prisoner in the U.S. than being a soldier in Europe. So it was in a report from the House Committee on Military Affairs to Congress. They said that our POW policy was working in breaking down the morale of German troops, making them willing, even eager to surrender. Now, Our camp closed down. As you can see, this is like the last report. They started closing down on the 16th, 17th. So really the 18th is when the last of the prisoners were sent out. So March 18th is like the last day. All prisoners had to go back to Europe, but a good many of them didn't want to go. Now, at some camps, not ours, but at some camps, they would have the equivalent of an exit interview. And it wasn't out of the realm of possibility for some, especially the younger prisoners, to say, they had the time of their life. Because, had there not been a war, these young men would have sought adventure before settling down with a career or family, and they would have gone to college. And thanks to our government, a lot of them were able to, because in the states like Kansas, Alabama, and Texas, where there was a state university near where a camp was located, the government would bring in professors from that university to teach college-level classes at the camp. So these younger, the college-age prisoners could take the courses, earn credits, and then transfer those credits back to their universities in Germany, so they weren't wasting time while they were here. And then sometimes you had German professors who were among the detainees, and they were allowed to teach as well. Now, when they went back, they were allowed to take $200 cash, not coupons, cash, if they had earned it, to help lubricate the decimated German economy. And then while they were here, they were actually could allocate some of their earnings to the Red Cross. Now, they couldn't say, just give this money to my family, but they could help their homeland in general. Now, our homeland's coffers certainly didn't suffer. In a report by the House Committee on Military Affairs to Congress in June of 1945, it was reported that since the National Works Program began, that $22 million had been paid by contractors to our government, and that our government had saved $80 million by hiring German POWs to work on the military installations. But really, the best part was of this whole POW policy and program was that during wartime, Germans and Americans became genuine friends, and those friendships lasted for generations after the war was over. Now, that's a story I tell every Wednesday that we run our trolley tour. But this year's special. This is the 80th anniversary of the arrival of German POWs, and the 8th of June fell on a Saturday. So I held a motor coach tour. It was 6 hours long. We drove all over Myrtle Beach and Conway. This is the coach out. This is out at Splinter City. This is where, so I had people walk around where the prisoners walked, you walked. And then we made it, in Myrtle Beach, I took them over to where Ace Hardware is, so they could see where the temporary camp was. We stopped at Pine Lakes, because Pine Lakes International Country Club technically was there during wartime, and it was our comfort stop before we hit the road to drive all the way out via 22 to 701 to the museum's Living History Farm, the L.W. Paul Living History Farm. So Marion, thank you so much, was our hostess that day. And so the cool thing is this farm was built to replicate to show what a farm in Horry County would look like in the early 20th century. Well, it's exactly what the farms looked like during World War II. So this is exactly what the prisoners were seeing and experiencing. So she basically taught us what they were working on. So we have the tobacco field there. We went over and walked along various buildings because different farms would have different buildings that could make different products and whatnot. And most exciting to me is that we had a blacksmith shop. Now, Mary, and I will confess to you that until I was standing in the shop with you, there was a couple of confessions here. I didn't really realize that certain farms, not all farms, but certain farms would have a blacksmith facility because, you didn't have a parts store. If something broke on your farm, somebody just had to make it and to replace these parts. Now, the other confession is, this is one of their volunteers. And now I am trying to wrangle my people, and I'm trying to take pictures, and I don't have my glasses on. I can't really see. And so finally, when he's got everybody up and he's giving the presentation, Marion kind of whispers to me, "Did you notice his hat?" Well, no, honey, I did not notice his hat. But as soon as you told me, look at that. They found that in their archives. PW. He is dressed as a prisoner of war. I was so touched. Thank you for doing that. But even more so, what compounds that is that there's a story from one of my friends. My friends had told me this about more than a year ahead of this tour, about a little relic that had been given that he had from his family. And for about a year and a half, I said, please, would you just send me some photographs of this thing and tell me about it? Well, the day before the tour, he texted me a picture and this story. The relic is a jar lid opener. Now, I don't know if you can see there's a little screw there. So basically you separate it, you put it around the jar, and that gets it open. So this jar, this is what he wrote to me. This jar lid opener was made by a German POW. My grandfather was a guard at the Splinter City POW camp when he befriended one of the prisoners. At some point, grandfather was talking to the POW about my grandmother, who was a very small lady and had trouble opening some of the jars that they had canned. A couple of weeks later, the POW presented this opener to my grandfather as a gift of friendship. And I was thinking, I couldn't figure out in that 24-hour period, there was no blacksmith shop at the airfield, so he must have been assigned to one of the farms. So your volunteer was actually, that's who he was replicating that day, that gentleman who made that jar lid opener. Now, if my friend Don Adams, if his grandfather was a guard at the POW camp, he would have had credentials. In my research, I have never seen what the credentials look like. But last year on my tour, I had a lady who said that her dad was a guard at a POW camp in Opelika, Alabama. And this is what, she sent me this. This is what his credentials look like. And I'm pretty sure there was probably across the board, all credentials at all camps. And so she said, my dad was Angelo John Engel. You see A.J. Engel. He was born in 1915. He was a German POW camp guard station in Opelika. And so I'm sure it's pretty simplistic, but you had to have credentials in order to be a guard. Now, what's the next one? Oh, yes, the tour continues. So Marion took us around and shows about the tobacco curing, and then that's what a typical house would have looked like. So when, no running water, thank you, she is the running water. And then so when those boys were brought to the table, that's probably what the table looked like right there, red and white checkered tablecloth. And so if y'all have not been out, that you've seen the advertisement already, but if you haven't been to that Living History Museum, please go, it's fabulous. And so our docent here had just, I don't know if you can see the batter is still in the bowl. She had just put the biscuits in the oven. Now they can't serve the food. So here we are. We've put in a pretty full day already. We are starving, smelling all that good food. But the next stop on the tour was Big D's trough, barbecue trough. So we were able to eat the same food, the same recipes that the prisoners would have eaten. So we had barbecue, fried chicken, chicken bog, collards, green beans, macaroni and cheese. And while I was sitting there eating, I received a phone call from the weekend anchor of WBTW 13, our CBS affiliate, Adriana Cotero. And so she said that she was in the area and she'd gotten my press release. And I said, oh, well, we're eating now, but why don't you meet us at the museum? So this was taken all upstairs, and we were on the evening news. So we were legit. We made history, conveying history. More footage. I told about what we were doing, and notice those photographs. In one of the reports, there's only one report that mentions photography. So on December 4th, 1944, 15 PWs were not assigned work, and they were sent to be photographed. So I'm assuming, and see, look, these aren't mug shots. These are photographs. This is a photo session. So allegedly, there are 13 headshots out there in the world, or at least had been at one time. So this is Hans Scope and Walter Sonnenberg. Now, almost through. When you go upstairs, you will see these two men's photographs in this footlocker. At this point, this was our last stop on the tour. We're going to head back to the Market Common after this. Marion shares two things. Well, two things. One is she invited me to be here today, so thank you very much. And the other thing is that she said about 20 years ago when this footlocker was donated, the family, there was a local Conway family who had it, the gentleman who actually donated it now lived in Columbia, that he sent a letter. It's an incredible letter. And it was about this particular locker. Now notice the name. It says, well, I thought it was a W. I thought it said Weber, Herman Weber. But up here it says Niebuhr. But this opens a whole brand new mystery, which I have not discussed with you. The box belonged to the POW who committed suicide. And after he committed suicide, all of his possessions, they drew lots among the prisoners. And Walter, whom you just saw, he worked for, he spoke pretty good English, and he worked for the American contractor who was the painter. And that's who, Mr. Burroughs. Mr. Burroughs Sr. was in charge of all the painting that went on at the camp. And so Walter won in the lot this box, but he didn't need it, so he gave it to the elder Mr. Burroughs. And so it stayed in the family, and then Charles, his son, back in 2004, donated it. Now, if there was a Niebuhr or a Weber who died by any means, he would have been buried at Camp Gordon. On their death roster, there is no Niebuhr, there is no Weber. We do know that Herman Walter committed suicide. Now, just because his name's not on the box didn't mean the box didn't belong to him. And I don't know if it was somebody else's box that he somehow procured, or if the day the guy was writing names on boxes, he just got his name wrong. The Herman part was right, but the last name was wrong. So we just don't know. But then just quickly, as I go over time, there was another page to the letter that tells this precious story of the commander of the whole airfield, not just the POW camp, the whole airfield. His wife liked to entertain at their quarters at the airfield. But she was upset that in order to decorate her home, the paint that she had to choose from, there was no choice. It was just the military issue paint. But then she noticed around camp that there were some buildings that had this like really beautiful hues of paint. So she goes to Mr. Burroughs and asks, okay, where'd that paint come from? And he said that 2 of the German POWs who were assigned to work for him were interior designers. So they took this military issue paint and with their skill, carefully mixed it and created these lovely shades. And she wanted those at her house. And because she was the commander's wife, she got them. So those 2 prisoners worked at her house for about 3 weeks. So when the job was finished, Mr. Burroughs goes, to go pick them up. And so she has him outside at the picnic table. They're drinking coffee. They're talking. And then at some moment, he kind of sort of looks in through the dining room window, and because he realizes that these 2 prisoners aren't loading up the truck to leave. They're inside the dining room with her 7-year-old daughter eating cake and ice cream. It was the daughter's birthday, and she had come to know them over the last 3 weeks, and they had been very kind to her. So it was her request that she have a little birthday party with these prisoners. Well, Mr. Burroughs was like, oh no, when the commander gets here, he's going to have my hide. And the commander's wife said, no. The commander, he runs the airfield. I run the commander's house. Don't you worry about that. So when the commander did arrive, he may or may not have been aware of what was going on, because he took Mr. Burroughs around to the other side of the house and, on a conversation where you couldn't see inside the dining room. And then a little bit later, they all left. There's another story in the other part of the letter where Mr. Burroughs, young Mr. Burroughs, says he remembers on Sunday evenings after Sunday dinner, his mom would pack a picnic basket. And she and his father would go back to the camp, and he would have somebody, usually Walter, who worked for him, to go to the prisoner's barracks and say that he needed some of the workers to come and clean up the paint shed. And when they got there, in the back, there would be this nice picnic of good home cooking with pies and cakes. So I love this letter. Thank you so much for sharing with me, because it just drives home the fact that during a time of war, we have all sorts of preconceptions or personal experiences of the horrors of war, but I just want to share these glimmers of compassion and evidence that when you put people together, it's really a wonderful thing. Thank you.